Loud and clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's Loud and Clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening now. I'm Brian Becker, and I'm joined in studio by co-host John Kiriakou. In our first hour, we take a look at two big stories. First, tomorrow, April 4th, marks the 50th anniversary of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Recent polls show that the majority of Americans do not believe that his vision of a just society has been realized. Many people, including the King family, also question the official story about who was responsible for the assassination. We are going to speak with William Pepper, a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife and widow, Coretta Scott King, and the man who more than any other pursued the case about who killed Dr. Martin Luther King during the past 4.5 decades. Then we continue our weekly economics series. We take a look every Tuesday at the top economic issues of the day. We're going to also look at Donald Trump's policies, the tax law, the new tariffs, China's responses, and Donald Trump's attack on Amazon.
But before we get to an examination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, we'll go over today's headlines, including 5 that we'll cover in depth in the second hour. First, thousands of teachers across Kentucky and Oklahoma have entered the second day of their strikes for better pay, benefits, and working conditions in a movement that has spread rapidly since West Virginia teachers successfully struck earlier this year. Next, a report published over the weekend by sports news website Deadspin showed dozens of television news anchors from local stations around the country owned by the conservative Sinclair Broadcasting Group reciting the exact same script warning against what they called biased and false news. The episode reveals the power of a company long criticized for pushing its conservative agenda into homes across the country. Then, Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in Ankara today to launch Turkey's first nuclear power plant with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani also in town to discuss Syria, energy, and defense issues. The Russian State Nuclear Energy Agency will build the $20 billion nuclear power facility. Meanwhile, the Russian state news agency noted that Russia will expedite the delivery of a Russian S-400 air defense system to Turkey. And then prosecutors in the Russia probe revealed last night that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein authorized them in August of last year to investigate allegations that President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was colluding with Russian government officials to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. The revelation comes amid a lawsuit filed by Manafort which challenges the special counsel's investigative authority and the indictments that have already been issued. And finally, yesterday, China announced an additional $3 billion in tariffs on U.S. goods, and the stock market took a huge hit. The big spike in stock market volatility indicates that a full-fledged trade war between the U.S. and China may be getting underway. The U.S. is now expected to announce further tariffs on $50 to $60 billion in Chinese imports, which the Chinese have already promised a response to in the same proportion. And in other headlines, answering a question at a press conference earlier today about Syria, President Trump stated, quote, "I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home," unquote. This appears to be a confirmation of the position he expressed at a rally in Ohio last week when he said, quote, "Very soon we're coming out of Syria," unquote. Trump made the remark standing alongside the visiting leaders of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Despite the British, EU, and US sanctions quickly imposed against Russia for the poisoning of the Skripals, the UK laboratory Porton Down has announced that it is unable to confirm that the nerve agent used is Russian. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons will meet in the morning to discuss the situation. French railway workers began a series of rolling strikes today to protest reforms to the publicly owned train company SNCF that they fear will lead to its privatization. Workers will be on strike for 3 days a week for the next 12 weeks. The SNCF strike is considered to be a major political challenge to the neoliberal economic agenda of French President Macron. Donald Trump told reporters today that he planned to send soldiers to patrol the U.S.-Mexico border, saying, quote, "Until we can have a wall and proper security, we're going to be guarding our border with the military. That's a big step," unquote. Trump was sitting next to Defense Secretary Jim Mattis when he made the comment. This is the latest in a series of hardline anti-immigrant remarks from Trump. Those are today's headlines. Next up is an examination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. That's all coming up next on Loud and Clear.
Loud and Clear.
Now we turn to the 50th anniversary of the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today, April 3rd, Dr. King was about to make a speech supporting sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee. His killing the next day, April 4th, came exactly 1 year after the day he made the famous Riverside Church speech where he came out decidedly in opposition to the U.S. war in Vietnam, a position that caused Dr. King to receive a tremendous backlash from establishment forces and from others. We're joined from New York by William Pepper. Mr. Pepper is an attorney. He's worked for years to prove the role of the U.S. government in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1967, Dr. King contacted Mr. Pepper after seeing his photo essay called The Children of Vietnam, which had been published in Ramparts magazine. It depicted the effects of napalm on Vietnamese children. He and Dr. King became friends, and after Dr. King's death, Mr. Pepper continued to represent the family of Martin Luther King Jr. Mr. Pepper has written 3 books, Act of State, Orders to Kill, and The Plot to Kill King. William Pepper, it's a great honor. Thanks for joining our show.
It's good to be with you.
Let's first talk about, before we get into the issue of who killed Martin Luther King, and obviously both the King family and yourself do not believe that James Earl Ray was the killer, certainly not the lone assassin, that the U.S. government had a role, and perhaps the primary role, perhaps the architect of this killing. But before we do that, I want to talk about April 3rd, Dr. King in Memphis speaking before sanitation workers. And for the entire year before that, and since he gave the Riverside speech at Riverside Church announcing his fervent opposition to the U.S. war in Southeast Asia, Dr. King, and many people don't know this, had become something of a pariah. We treat him now and remember his birthday every year, but people don't really realize how much opposition he received. Talk about that stance and your own role in helping Dr. King come out publicly as an opponent of the war in Vietnam.
Well, you're quite right. With respect to your assessment of what happened to Dr. King when he decided to oppose the war, he was called a traitor. His organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, lost about $1 million very quickly in terms of donations. And he took that position because he believed it was morally right and the only position that he could take. Yeah, as a citizen of the United States, Martin King believed without any question that he had to oppose the war in Vietnam. He saw it in every way as being morally unjust. He just wrenched and even wept at times about the war crimes that were being committed and on innocent victims, particularly children and the elderly. So that laid the groundwork for the enormous opposition to him in the year following, in all of 1967.
What was happening in the country? That was a transitional moment. I can remember because I was quite young at the time, but I was 15. My parents, because they were active in the civil rights movement in Rochester, New York, had me going to demonstrations or rallies or community meetings from the time that I was 11 or 12 years old, mostly in support of the black community. But when you came to anti-war protests, they were mostly white people. Even though the anti-war sentiment in the black community was so profound, it seemed to me in 1967, even as a young person, that Dr. King leading a mainly black movement, but having the prestige that transcended all movements, by becoming a leader or an outspoken critic of the war in Vietnam, he would be a leader of both communities. And in fact, the U.S. anti-war movement would become a black and white movement. But of course, he was killed 1 year to the day after he came out. Do you agree with that? I mean, it seemed like he was the emerging voice of the anti-war movement.
No, I think there's no question about that. And he combined peace and freedom. He combined peace and the struggle for peace with the struggle against poverty, which he felt also very deeply about. So he linked up these issues, and as a result of doing that, he linked up constituencies. And you're quite right. He had a large white following, along with black following, in terms of economic impoverishment and racial injustice and oppression. So he went forward as a unifier with respect to those issues.
William Pepper is our guest. Mr. Pepper was a friend of Martin Luther King, a close associate. His own work and his own photo essay called The Children of Vietnam, which depicted the horrors of the Vietnam War. And when I'm talking about horrors, we're talking about the pictures of kids running down the street in their village, down the road in their village, unpaved roads, with their bodies set on fire with napalm dropped by U.S. aircraft. These searing images that for the first time brought the war into the living rooms of Americans had this profound impact. He looked at your photo essay. He contacted you. You became friends with Dr. Martin Luther King. Talk about King the person.
Well, he was a very gentle person and very thoughtful. And he had a very strong, as I've said earlier, he had a very strong moral sense. And this guided him in terms of the public issues that were awash in the country at the time. And he rebuffed all criticism which came from him, for him, and from him, from within and without, that tried to get him to effectively become a bit more neutral in terms of the establishment and the funds that his organization needed. He cast those concerns aside and replaced them with a very strong moral position, and that was the nature of him. But he was always committed to nonviolence, and nonviolence was very much a part of his approach, and he insisted upon it with respect to those around him in the movement.
Mr. Pepper, Dr. King, of course, knew that he would have to pay a political price for coming out against the war at that time. Tell us a little bit about his calculations and how he came to that decision. And then once he came to the decision, how he pushed forward with it.
He just thought this was the only decision, the only position that he could take. And he decided to simply go out as strongly as he could in that direction. He realized that he would meet opposition. I don't think he anticipated the degree of opposition and the degree of hatred and vitriolic calumny that was just poised to go on and against him. Don't think he anticipated that. I don't think he anticipated quite the loss of money that did occur, because the white community had been coming out against the war gradually for some period of time, and he saw that as a developing energy, developing force. So I think he sort of miscalculated in terms of the degree of enmity that he would receive and the amount of funds that would be taken from him. But in fairness, he really didn't give that much thought or concern, because he knew what he had to do was right and just, and so he just went ahead.
A few days ago, the Washington Post published a front-page story, a really extensive story, and it quotes our guest, and it talks about our guest. Maybe it talks about rather than quotes. Our guest is William Pepper, New York lawyer, civil rights activist, a friend of Dr. Martin Luther King, someone who's written several books and was kept closely to Coretta Scott King and the King family, who doubted and actually disbelieved, is a better way to say it, the government narrative about who killed Martin Luther King Jr. 50 years ago tomorrow. We know, William Pepper, that when Lee Harvey Oswald was accused on November 22nd, 1963 of killing John F. Kennedy, that the accusal wasn't ever really tried in court, because 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot dead in the Dallas police station. After the killing of Martin Luther King, James Earl Ray was identified as the assassin. He was on the run. He was finally captured, I think, in the UK. But then suddenly he pled guilty, and there was suddenly no trial. So again, the assassin, we just sort of had to take the word of the FBI and the government about who the assassin was, because there was no trial, just like there was no trial for Lee Harvey Oswald, because in that case, he was shot dead. In this article, and I'm going to read a couple sentences from the Washington Post, astride all this controversy for the last 40 years has been William Pepper, a New York lawyer and civil rights activist who knew and worked with King. Pepper first visited James Earl Ray in prison in 1978, along with Ralph Abernathy, one of Dr. King's closest associates. Pepper became convinced of Ray's innocence and continued to investigate the case even after Ray died. Pepper wrote 3 books outlining the conspiracy, most recently The Plot to Kill King in 2016, which were largely ignored by the media. He defended Ray in a mock trial on HBO in 1993. Ray was found not guilty at the mock trial and filed and tried the Memphis civil lawsuit that found the government liable for Dr. King's death. Wow, I mean, I wouldn't have thought I was reading this because I read it in the Washington Post. But let's talk about what led you first to become suspicious that James Earl Ray was not the actual assassin? And
before you answer the question, Mr. Pepper, I want to read a very short quote from the Dick Cavett Show, August 9th, 1969. Dick Cavett is speaking with Percy Foreman, James Earl Ray's criminal defense attorney, and an LBJ crony. Cavett says, "A lot of people were astounded at how you got Ray to change the plea from not guilty to guilty." And Foreman responded, "I didn't get him to change the plea." And then laughing, he said, "I simply told him that I thought he would be executed if he didn't." Go right ahead.
I spent 5 hours interrogating James Earl Ray in August of 1978, as you mentioned, with Ralph Abernathy and others, Jim Lawson and others in that small room. And we all came out. I put him under enormous stress. We all came out of that room with the belief that this man was not the shooter. We didn't know what role he might have played, but we knew as a result of that interrogation that he was not the shooter. He did not shoot Dr. King. That was unanimous, everybody in the room. Now, because of that, he raised a number of questions that caused me to go into Memphis and begin to look around, spend a lot of time on the streets, a lot of time with people who had been ignored, who were witnesses, and with pieces of information. And then I would go back to Ray continually and ask him more questions and try to get him to sort of open up more. He continually started to ask me to become his attorney. His original lawyer had really left the case by 1982, I guess. I refused. I said, "I can't represent you until I'm sure you had no knowing belief in this assassination." And that I came to that conclusion in 1988, and I began to represent James Earl Ray from that point on, 1988, until he died in 1998. And we failed to get even an evidentiary hearing, which we wanted desperately. But the evidence after the mock trial, when we were turned down by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and denied cert by the Supreme Court, the idea came up to have a mock trial. And it was sponsored by Thames Television and HBO. And we ran that trial for about 10 days, and the jury took 7 hours to find Ray not guilty. And that was on the basis of the evidence that we had at that time in 1993. It was just, that was the only evidence we had then. I wrote the first book, Orders to Kill, and I published it in 95, and then more and more witnesses started coming forward, more and more evidence started coming out. But it was already probably too late in the American criminal justice system. We'd have had to go back and start all over again. So the King family and I decided to do a civil trial against a man who was deeply implicated in the case, named Lloyd Showers. We used him as the defendant along with others, unnamed others. And we tried that case for 30 days with 70 witnesses in 1999. And we put out an enormous amount of new evidence of Ray's innocence. Ray died, however, unfortunately, in 1998. He knew this was afoot, and he refused to take advantage of any pleas by the government that he should finally confess, and they would let him go because he was quite ill. He refused those offers, and the reason he pled guilty in the first place was not because he was afraid of being executed, because he believed all the evidence pointed in the direction of his innocence, which it did, but because Percy Foreman, his lawyer, told him at one point, "James, my health is bad, and I cannot give you a best defense." And he said that to him, and then he said, "But I'll give you, if you plead guilty, I'll give you $500. I'll give your brother $500, and you can hire a new lawyer, set aside the guilty plea, and go on." Now, that was the scenario of Ray's guilty plea, and Foreman, in fact, did provide that $500 and did give it to Jerry Ray, and for James Earl Ray to try to set aside the verdict. When the judge Marvin Frankel in the moot court case saw that check, he just shook his head. He couldn't believe that the defense lawyer would buy his client's guilty plea. But that was what happened. And we tried the case in 1999. It took that jury 59 minutes with all the new evidence, 59 minutes to find James, that James had no liability, placing liability on agents of the government of the United States, state of Tennessee, city of Memphis. And I wrote the next book, Act of State, in 2003, which basically covered that trial. And that resulted in yet more evidence coming out, which was so damning and so conclusive as to the murder of Martin Luther King that had to be developed over a period really of 12 years. 12 more years. I had to wait because a key witness, if I used his testimony, everything was, by the way, was under oath. The Plot to Kill King contains all evidentiary material, trial transcripts, depositions, everything under oath. But if I had put forward this deposition of Lenny Curtis, who was a janitor at the police shooting range, I was sure they would kill him.
What did he say? We have 5 minutes left.
He named the shooter. The shooter was a Memphis police officer named Frank Strauser, who he saw him being given a special gun. He saw him practicing with it all day long. And so Lenny had all this information that he observed. And when Strauser left at 3 o'clock that afternoon, he knew where he was going and what he was about to do. So that was the situation with Frank Strauser. What is not generally known in the world are two things. One, James Earl Ray's escape from prison was arranged by the FBI. He had been profiled by Hoover by the Commissioner of Corrections in Missouri. He had been chosen, and his escape was arranged. Clyde Tolson came in and gave the leader of the Dixie Mafia $25,000, and the Dixie Mafia leader, rode to the prison, gave that money to the warden to arrange James's escape.
That was before, just so people understand, Clyde Tolson is the number 2 guy at the FBI. What you're suggesting is that the FBI arranged for James Earl Ray, who was already in prison in 1967, 68, to escape so that they could then perhaps carry out the assassination working between the FBI and Memphis police or some police officers in Memphis? James had a handler. Raul Coelho was his handler, and James was profiled, and he was set to be the patsy. And they kept him where they had to keep him. They had him buy a gun, which was not the murder weapon by any means. And they had him come to the rooming house and put his stuff up there, but then told him to get lost. And as they used that room for the staging, so James was profiled to be the patsy,
And it was Clyde Tolson who brought the money in from Hoover. Now, Tolson made several visits. He was working very closely with the Russell Adkins family, the Dixie Mafia family, as well as Frank Holloman, who was head of police and fire. Holloman had been working for Hoover for many years before he came into that job. So they were well fixed with the Dixie Mafia on the ground. The shooter was well chosen. He was an excellent shot. The bullet hit Martin King, and it looked as though it was a fatal shot. The reality is he was alive, and he was taken to the emergency room, and they were working on him. And when the head of neurology and the chief doctor, Green Bland, came into the room with two men in suits, he told them, "Let him die and get out of this room." And he threw them all out of the emergency room, and as they were going out, the surgical nurse heard them gathering spit up in their mouths, and as she was at the door, she turned and she saw them spit on the body of Martin King on the table where he was. And then she saw Dr. Bland take a pillow and put it over Martin King's head and face and suffocate him to death, because he was still living. Now, he might have died anyway from that gunshot wound, but at that point he was still living, and they were not going to take any chances in the fact that he might survive. They were going to make sure that he would never leave Memphis. In fact, never leave that emergency room. And the reason we know this is true is we have corroboration, because once again, the son of Russell Adkins sat in a meeting 2-3 weeks before the actual killing. That meeting was with his older brother and Dr. Green Bland. And Bland, who had been the Adkins, had been the Adkins family doctor, said to Russell Adkins Jr., "You've got to make sure he goes to St. Joseph's Hospital. If the bullet doesn't kill him, we will make sure that he doesn't leave there alive."
William Pepper, let me ask you, is it your conclusion, based on 40-plus years of investigation and being in court, that the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, helped kill Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.?
No question, they coordinated, and Clyde Tolson was the man on the ground. I have photographs of Tolson with the Adkins family. There's no question. Ronnie was told to call him Uncle Clyde, and he carried Hoover's instructions as well as his money. And the money was put in bags, and the bags had names on it.
We're completely out of time. We know that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover had targeted King, smeared King, carried out surveillance against King, but our guest, William Pepper, attorney and friend of Martin Luther King Jr., friend of Coretta Scott King, his wife and widow, friend of the King family today, has done a remarkable job piecing together, staying on the story to tell the truth, not only about who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. really was, the radical Dr. Martin Luther King, but how he died. You're listening to Loud and Clear. After a short break, we'll be right back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
Welcome back to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker.
And I'm John Kiriakou.
Today we continue our weekly series. It's every Tuesday, looking at the top economic issues of the day. We're joined this week, as we are every week, from San Francisco by Daniel Sankey. Daniel is a financial policy analyst. Daniel Sankey, welcome back to Loud and Clear.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Wow, there's a lot of news, of course. There were tariffs and counter tariffs, and the stock market went down, and then it's up a little bit. But there's also the now unrelenting attack by the White House, by Trump, against Amazon. And, of course, Amazon owner Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. He owns a lot of other things, too. Anyway, let's start with the Amazon story.
Certainly. There's a lot of angles here to cover, so it bears kind of digging into here. In short, Trump is lashing out at Amazon, both claiming that it's causing the United Postal Service, the USPS, to lose, billions of dollars and that it's unfair, and then also accusing it of causing retailers to shut down all over the U.S., which frankly is an accurate description of kind of Amazon's business model. I think really what we need to understand, though, is Jeff Bezos owns Washington Post, and Washington Post has been heavily critical of Trump. So there's an angle there as well. But additionally, I think this is also kind of a continuation of this administration's attack on the tech industry, which was heavily supportive of Hillary, had spent, 8 years insulating itself with Obama, and Hillary was really going to be seen as, his successor. And so just kind of continuation of that power, and was very upset and distraught and taken off guard when Trump won the election. And had spent a lot of money to try to keep him out of office. And then finally, there's, a contradiction here in that the kind of move towards global neoliberal capitalism, that with capitalism without borders, capitalism without a country, is really antithetical to Trump's stance, which is, of course, a return to nationalism and a return to America first at the expense of other nations around the globe. So this kind of sums up a lot of the fight that's going on right now between different factors in the ruling class, between producers that benefit from this nationalist agenda, and then companies like in the tech industry and in the banking industry who are harmed by this more tariff-heavy nationalist America First agenda.
Let's talk about one other point in terms of the Amazon struggle, because Trump's base is partly, maybe mainly, middle-class people. There's a lot of referencing to white working-class people, but when you look at who a lot of the Trump supporters were in different places, they were middle-class, small business owners as well. Amazon has put a lot of small business owners out of business. Is this a political play to that middle-class base, the small shop owners who are being crushed by not just Amazon, but Walmart and all of the big retailers and, of course, online shopping?
Yeah, I think that is definitely a political calculus. It's common rhetoric in far-right organizations to have this kind of anti-establishment, almost anti-big business rhetoric, where at least they attack the banks and they attack other companies that so clearly have a huge advantage and a huge upper hand against working people, as a way of garnering support and as a way of galvanizing the people. And you can imagine a small business owner who's losing out to Amazon, who just is this money-making machine that can't seem to be stopped. And they're, trying to make a buck, selling shoes or simple things like that. And I'm sure it's very empowering to have someone in that office attacking this company that's taken so much from them. But I think we need to go further than that and understand that this is just rhetoric, and that in instances when the right has taken real substantial political power, the far right, they have insulated themselves immediately with these interests. I tire of the trope of comparing Trump to Hitler, but certainly he used a lot of that rhetoric. And when he came to power, the banking industry and him were very close to each other, and he gave them a lot of favorable connections. Trump is a very wealthy business person. These people who own these massive corporations have far more in common with him than the people on Main Street trying to turn a buck. So it is a political calculus, but it's also extremely dishonest.
Well, yeah, the demagogy of the big capitalists sort of championing the cause of the smaller business owners, and yet at the same time having policies, and then once in office screwing those same people, to put it mildly. That demagogy is commonplace, and it's been with us, as Daniel said, for more than 100 years. Well, hundreds of years, actually. But let's talk about what the actual specific complaint that Donald Trump has with Amazon. It's about the collection of sales taxes. And what Trump is essentially saying, I think this is what he's saying, is that while Amazon collects sales tax on the products it sells directly to online shoppers, Amazon is also a platform for third-party sellers. And those third-party sellers contract with Amazon. They sell their products through the Amazon platform, but Amazon doesn't collect sales tax on those third-party sellers. Thus, those third-party sellers have an advantage, and Amazon reaps an advantage or a reward by providing them basically with a tax shelter. Is that about what this is?
Yeah, that's definitely what it's about. That's how Amazon is able to draw in a lot of these, retailers that are finding themselves unable to compete with big giants. So, if you can't beat them, join them. And while Amazon gets to keep a cut of the profits, they at least get to stay alive and keep their heads above water. And then Amazon incentivizes that. One could almost say subsidizes that through not collecting these taxes, kind of having this hands-off sort of, hey, it's up to them to pay their taxes, not our problem approach, which, of course, is a huge incentive to these small businesses who are already struggling anyway against giants like Amazon to then maybe get some kind of a tax break out of it. And then there are other larger sellers on Amazon that do make quite a bit of money. So I don't want to give the impression that they're all just kind of small people scraping by, but many of them are. And that's such a funny criticism coming from Trump. I mean, we're barely out of passing a GOP tax bill that effectively allowed Amazon to not pay taxes, last year. And then if somehow, he's concerned about businesses paying their taxes, it seems odd a way to go about it to pass this tax reform bill, which gives them huge tax breaks. Amazon doesn't pay tax. Apple avoids a huge amount of taxes through various offshore and international, conglomerates and subsidiaries. This is, how the businesses run. So I think it's a little political rhetoric, and it's a little dishonest that all of a sudden he's really concerned about Amazon's making sure that its third-party sellers pay all their sales tax.
Daniel, Bloomberg says that there are actually a couple of things that Trump can do to hurt Jeff Bezos and Amazon, but that they're akin to these Nixonian tactics that we saw at the height of Watergate in the 1970s when, for example, Richard Nixon, in his anger with the Washington Post, threatened to withdraw the Post's broadcast licenses. So what could Trump do if he were serious about this fight with Amazon? What could he do to make Amazon's life or Jeff Bezos's life a little more miserable?
He could do a lot of things. I mean, one thing we saw in the markets was this huge sell-off of tech stocks, right, over yesterday and last week. And that is because a lot of investors see regulation coming. Especially in the wake of the Russiagate, hysteria. We're seeing Facebook being forced to testify before Congress, and they're realizing that this hysteria is spreading into the tech industry and requiring them to comply with a whole host of new regulations. He can do that with with Amazon. He can go to the various regulatory industry bodies that he's placed very loyal, sympathetic members in, and have them, unleash a barrage of regulation. There can be auditing. He can have the IRS look through their financials and ensure that they are compliant with a very complex, arcane tax code. He can look at different consumer protection practices and policies and ensure that Amazon is compliant with all of them. I mean, when you're as big as Amazon is, regulators can find ways to make it stick if they really want to, and if they know where to look and what tires to kick. And if Amazon really wants to mobilize them, they can. That can definitely hurt Amazon's bottom line. And even if maybe they're not able to implement those regulations, it can get tied up in court for a long time while Amazon wastes money and time fighting them.
And then tell me what Amazon can do. I'm fascinated by this allegation, this utterly false allegation from the president that Amazon is somehow ripping off the Postal Service, which he says is already a money loser. It's not a money loser. It's a money maker. So he's wrong on both counts. But is Amazon big enough? Is it powerful enough? Is it rich enough to either use UPS, DHL, FedEx, or to create its own delivery system if it wants to somehow get back at Donald Trump?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they already have their own couriers and deliverers now. I think they couldn't do it, next week. There would be some time to pivot. But Amazon has made it very clear that they're willing to lose money in the short term, a lot of money in the short term, if it means they're going to make money in the long run. They can pivot. They can move away from USPS and start utilizing all these other services. They can dump them, and that will cost, federal government a ton of revenue. There's other things they can do. They can support other candidates against that are contrary to Trump's policies. They have very deep pockets to do that. They can lobby regulators. They can lobby different legislators and lawmakers on Capitol Hill. There's a lot Amazon could do, and this is not just a simple kind of fight. This is an incredibly, arguably the most powerful and most wealthy company in the United States right now. And they definitely have the resources to marshal against him.
You know, Amazon destroyed bookstores in America.
Yeah,
I mean, they were already on the ropes, but I mean, it consciously destroyed them, consciously by underselling them and taking big losses in order to undermine bookstores. Because, you know, if you write a book, John, and you do write books, you are an author, you have to have a platform. People have to see your book. They have to buy it. They have to look at it first, though. If you drive the bookstores out of business, where can people go? Where can authors go except to Amazon?
It's the only place.
And in fact, if you look back, I'm looking at an article in 2012 from Forbes, not a progressive, not a left-wing, the capitalist tool Forbes. The headline, Amazon is killing the book business. And that was the effort both in the United States and in the UK to crush small bookstores. And, you know, when you think about books and reading, you think about bookstores as the place where people gathered. I mean, for me as a young person, bookstores were, besides the library, perhaps my favorite, and maybe bars.
Oh, me too.
My favorite place.
Yes.
But the bookstores really are gone. Barnes & Noble, I mean, they were all targeted by Bezos and Amazon. So in some ways, you know, we now look to Amazon because it's convenient. You don't have to go to the store. You can buy stuff, etc. But here you do have a big sector of what was the originally existing economy just 10, 15 years ago. Not just books, but books in particular, that's been completely transformed by this ruthless, hyper-capitalist online shopping model. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, that the proliferation of monopoly under Amazon is a carefully considered tactic that it engages in. I alluded to before, they're willing to lose a lot of money in the short term if they make money in the long term, and that's absolutely the case. I mean, think for a moment, you know, if Amazon turned to FedEx or UPS and said, hey, we're thinking of dumping USPS. What kind of deal can you give us? I mean, they'd be ecstatic. They'd be drooling over this. They'd love to take all that on. They would build new facilities if they had to, you know, because they know that as big as Amazon is right now, they're going to be even bigger in 5 years probably. So Amazon's power to wield monopoly, you know, they bought Whole Foods, so now they own this whole popular grocery store, which is, of course, very different than bookstores. They're going to move into other retail markets. And the goal is a very intentional monopolization. You can lose a lot of money up front. You can spend a lot of money up front to give cut rate prices and undercut the competition and outcompete them. Because once you have that monopoly, well, now you set the price and all the money comes to you. There's no other option to go anywhere else. If you want a book, you buy it on Amazon. So this is a very intentional strategy that they've continued to engage in, and that, you know, that fuels some of the fury and fear from working class people that are appealed to by Trump's rhetoric of, you know, quotes taking on Amazon, because they have very legitimate grievances. They've lost a tremendous amount of money.
You know, and I'm looking at a headline here, John. It's just from 2 days ago. Retailers race against Amazon to automate stores. So what Amazon is creating is automated stores without workers. They've created the huge warehouses where the workers in those warehouses, every move you make and every second that you take making that move is recorded, it's logged, it's overseen by, I mean, people are,
oh yes,
they talk about being an appendage to the machine. The worst fear is going back for hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution. People, human beings, workers are literally appendages to the Walmart warehouse machine. But now they're getting rid, and I think this is what's coming with the Whole Foods purchase too. By the way, I go to Whole Foods sometimes, and there's less and less on the shelves since Amazon bought it, because Amazon is also providing the service where you can just sit at home on your couch. You don't even have to go to the supermarket. There's a little army of shoppers now in my local Whole Foods running around, and they're also on the clock. They're racing. I mean, it's actually becoming dangerous. They're racing around.
They're buying food for customers, clients.
For customers. And then out front, in front of the store, there's like all of these shelves where people are bags And then like Uber drivers and others are racing up to pick up the bags and get them delivered within a 2-hour time frame. And again, you know where this is going. It's going to the elimination of human labor, right? Because, and again, people will go along with it because it's either cheaper or more convenient. But ultimately, as we transition to a society where the role of labor becomes more and more relegated to the machine, it poses huge, gigantic questions that Amazon doesn't have to worry about. Amazon only has to worry about, say, its stock market shares are tanking today because of Trump's attack. So what does that mean for investors? They have to worry about the next quarter. But we should be worrying about society. We should be worrying not just about the profit margins of the next quarter, but what kind of society we want to live in. Anyway, go ahead, Daniel.
That's not just for Amazon either. You know, you think of companies like Uber or Lyft or TaskRabbit, where there is this disintermediation between the employees and the employer. It reminds me kind of industrial era, 1800s in like the United Kingdom or something, where there's this, mob of workers outside the factory, desperate, clamoring for a job. The foreman, points to a couple of people, ushers them in back. Everyone else has to go home unemployed. The people are paid, half a penny for every sheet of metal they press or whatever. They crank them out just as desperately, as quickly as they can. And then, they get their tiny paycheck and they have no guarantee that tomorrow they'll get picked. Maybe they won't get picked. Maybe they'll, go hungry. And it's just a completely perilous and precarious way of conducting oneself in society. There's no security. And that's the point. Insecure labor produces incredibly cheap labor because they have very little footing to stand on, because they're not organized in some kind of way that can actually take on these companies. So yes, this is definitely the direction they'll drive in. And if possible, they'll get people there. Of course, this is to say nothing of the rise of automation, where Amazon is absolutely trying to create grocery stores that are not staffed by humans, where you go into some app, you punch in what you want, and then there's, some cubby or some, locker you can go into that's assigned to you and get your groceries or whatever. But the idea being it'll entirely be done by drones, it'll entirely be on the back end. There might be 1 or 2 employees just to keep an eye on it and if something breaks down, but otherwise, what would have normally employed potentially hundreds of people will employ maybe 3 or something like that.
And, in biographies, recent biographies that have come out about Jeff Bezos, they all say the same thing, that he makes no attempt to mask any of this. This is the goal. The goal is to employ as few people as possible and to maximize profits as much as possible. He doesn't care that he has whatever it is, $84 billion, and you don't. He doesn't care. He doesn't see his job in society as employing the largest number of people. It's all about the money. It's all about the profit.
And the same is true for all of the other online companies and for all the other retailers. I mean, this is the sort of, I'm glad we're talking about this, John, because it kind of gets past the headlines of, is Trump right? Of course, Trump is a demagogue. I mean, as Absolutely. Daniel pointed out, he's a demagogue, but there are underlying issues that do need to be discussed when it comes to what Amazon is doing. Since we're a news and analysis show, and sometimes we dabble in history,
right?
I want to bring up the Luddites because it was just 200 years ago that weavers and textile workers in Britain saw the machine, their version back then, of what we're witnessing with online shopping, the latest advances in technology that make workers an appendage to the machine or workers unnecessary. They saw the machine, the technology itself, as the enemy. So they started sabotaging the machines.
The machines.
They destroyed the machines. And Luddites get a bad rap in history because they were always like, oh, you're against progress.
Well, it's an epithet now.
It's an epithet. But when you go back to what the Luddites were actually doing, they couldn't stop the clock of history from going forward. New machinery is here. It's not going back. It means other things can happen. But, there could be a way of looking at machinery, which is if we don't have to be a weaver in the same number of hours, or if we don't have to do all of our own shopping, we could have, say, other things to do in life that are recreational or cultural or aesthetic or, something that's personally rewarding. But when the same group of employers hold the people hostage, and if you don't have that job, you're not going to be able to feed your family. It's not going to be like relaxation time. It's going to be desperation time. Some of the same social problems that the Luddites were facing 200 years ago are being faced by working people today, Daniel. But again, we can't stop the technology. We have to do other things, but it is a phenomena.
Absolutely. And I always felt bad for, Luddite being an epitaph and this kind of, these dumb backwards people trying to stop progress. But, I think what you witnessed was an act of desperation. I mean, they were terrified and they were losing everything, their ability to feed themselves and their family. So they lashed out. So they damaged machines because they saw no other option as a way to protect themselves. So, I mean, really, it's a very sad and very, hurtful act of desperation. I think that as we look in our society today and we look at automation, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want to do with it? Under our current society, automation means no work. Automation means poverty. Automation means joblessness. Under a society where the workers control the productive capacity of society, all the things that produce the things we need to live happy and full lives, automation would be wonderful. You could say, yeah, I don't have a job. I can go do something else. I can paint or learn a language or reconnect with my kids or, go to the beach or something like that because robots are doing it, because robots are better at it. Under capitalism, that's not the point, because the point is to reduce workers because this wealth is controlled by a tiny few. But if wealth is controlled by the society and those productive capacities are controlled by society, then there's no need to fear that automation. It can be celebrated. It can be accelerated. It can be utilized in a lot of ways. So I think we need to really consider how we organize ourselves as a society. We cannot automate all the jobs away under capitalism without producing a horde of desperate, angry, frightened people that will, turn the society into chaos. We have to create a rational society, a society for people to live in, a society that creates needs for them. And for me, that is a society where the wealth of society, where the productive capacity of society are controlled by the workers who produce the wealth. I feel like that's the only humane way we can go as automation accelerates.
Well, it would be a definition of democracy. We think of democracy as the right to vote every 2 years or 4 years, but do we have a job or do we have a guaranteed basic income?
Right.
Do we have the ability to go to a doctor? Like, these are the things that actually matter more than the right to vote, but they're not. We don't call them democracy. We call those other things, like as if democracy can't talk about human beings' other needs rather than the need to have representative democracy, which we need. Of course, we need an elected representative democracy, but we also need to have social and economic rights. When you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was passed in December 1948, it includes the right to vote, but it includes other things: the right to food, the right to an income, the right to shelter, the right to health care. And of course, we know it just as it's common sense that those are fundamental issues in people's lives. When you get up tomorrow morning, you're not going to mainly think, first and foremost, who's running in the midterm elections in November. You're going to think, like, how are my kids doing?
Right.
Is my job secure? All of those kind of things. I mean, but that's why I think this is a good discussion to look at. In a way, Trump is raising the issue of Amazon and challenging the role of Amazon, but he's doing it because he's doing it in a demagogic and reactionary way. He can't really come to a solution or even approach the question that begs for solutions regarding the things that we're talking about. But we need to talk about them. And Amazon actually, I mean, why should it be privately owned by Jeff Bezos? I mean, why should this guy, as you said, John, $84 billion?
And we've got to be bumping up against monopoly status in at least some of the components of Amazon, no? Brian, you pointed out that Amazon has driven bookstores out of business. It really has driven bookstores out of business. The only one that's hanging on is Barnes & Noble, and that's by the skin of its teeth. I read recently that one of the reasons Barnes & Noble is hanging on is because you can sit and have a cup of coffee there, and that's how they make some of their money. But Daniel, do you think that we're going to get to the point, or perhaps we have gotten to the point where at least in some of these business components of Amazon, we have reached monopoly status?
Oh, I think, definitely we've reached monopoly status. I think if we talk about the ideal of monopoly where it's truly just one company and no others, I mean, strictly speaking, we haven't hit that. But really, practically speaking, we've hit monopoly. Because even if other companies don't say Amazon on them and aren't directly controlled by Jeff Bezos, think of something like USPS, which we were just talking about now. He can control USPS. He can move his contracts away, and he can decide what the company charges and how the company is forced to function in the future. So that's just a simple example. There are so many others. You think of Apple driving down prices in China where they can set prices with different manufacturers there, and the manufacturers have to, put up or shut up. They have to accept it. So we've absolutely reached a monopoly status with things like Amazon, with things like Walmart. And at what social cost? It's been a tremendous social cost as people have become more disaffected, more disconnected from society, where they don't have a place within it, where they don't connect with their, fellow human beings, where profit, is the only purpose. So at what cost? At the cost of alienating everyone from themselves and their communities for purposes of Jeff Bezos being currently the most wealthy, person in the world. We have to ask ourselves, is that worth it? Is that the ideals we want as a human species? Is this the ideas we want in our society? Is that one person should be this wealthy? Is that worth everything else? And I think for the vast majority of people, the answer is a resounding no.
Yeah, and it's really the people in the warehouse who are making the thing work, and the people who are the drivers and those shoppers running around Whole Foods. They're the ones doing all the work. Bezos is making deals and doing media appearances. It's the most valuable public company, fourth most valuable public company in the world. It's the largest internet company by revenue. It's the eighth largest employer in the United States. As Daniel said, not a pure monopoly, but for all intents and purposes, this is monopoly.
My brother is a very prominent music writer and producer in Hollywood. And he told me once that when music was still sold on CD, and now, of course, most of it's not, it's all downloaded, but when it was sold on CD, Amazon took 75% of the listed price. So if you're an artist and you really rely on these CD sales to make a living, 75% of it right off the top went to Amazon, and artists couldn't make a living. They were making a fraction of what they were making in the 1970s, in the 1980s, before the advent of Amazon. Now that's changed in music, but not in things like books or household supplies or household goods, office supplies. Amazon controls all of that.
We're out of time, but we're going to give you the last word. We're talking about, of course, the Amazon fiefdom and how authors and musicians have become the new serfs. But go ahead, Daniel, 30 seconds left.
I think that it's really important that these workers that are creating the wealth for Amazon and others start to realize that they need to start working and organizing and fighting to build a better society, a society without Amazon.
That's it.
And it's going to be a tough struggle because Amazon is so powerful, but they're going to do it. Anyway, John, we're out of time. We want to thank Daniel Sankey once again. He joins us every Tuesday to talk about the big economic issues facing society and facing all of us. Stay with us. You're listening to Loud and Clear.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
From the studios of Radio Sputnik in downtown Washington, D.C., it's Loud and Clear. We take you inside the news 5 days a week. It's happening, and it's happening now. I'm John Kiriakou, and I'm joined in studio by co-host Brian Becker. In this hour, we take a look at the breaking news of the day. First, thousands of teachers across Kentucky and Oklahoma have entered the second day of their strikes for better pay, benefits, and working conditions in a movement that has spread rapidly since West Virginia teachers successfully struck earlier this year. Next, a report published over the weekend by sports news website Deadspin showed dozens of television news anchors from local stations around the country owned by the conservative Sinclair Broadcasting Group reciting the exact same script warning against what they called biased and false news. The episode reveals the power of a company long criticized for pushing its conservative agenda into homes across the country. Then, Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in Ankara today to launch Turkey's first nuclear power plant with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani also in town to discuss Syria, energy, and defense issues. The Russian State Nuclear Energy Agency will build the $20 billion nuclear power facility. Meanwhile, the Russian State News Agency noted that Russia will expedite the delivery of a Russian S-400 air defense system to Turkey. And then prosecutors in the Russia probe revealed last night that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein authorized them in August of last year to investigate allegations that President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was colluding with Russian government officials to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. The revelation comes amid a lawsuit filed by Manafort, which challenges the special counsel's investigative authority and the indictments that have already been issued. And finally, yesterday, China announced an additional $3 billion in tariffs on U.S. goods, and the stock market took a huge hit. The big spike in stock market volatility indicates that a full-fledged trade war between the U.S. and China may be getting underway. The U.S. is now expected to announce further tariffs on $50 to $60 billion in Chinese imports, which the Chinese have already promised a response to in the same proportion. That's all coming up next on Loud and Clear. But first we turn to teacher strikes and protests across the country. Thousands of teachers across Kentucky and Oklahoma have entered the second day of their strikes for better pay, benefits, and working conditions in a movement that has spread rapidly since West Virginia teachers successfully struck earlier this year. We're joined from Greencastle, Indiana by Derek Ford. He's an assistant professor of education studies at DePauw University and a community organizer whose latest book is Education and the Production of Space. Derek, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Derek, this really does seem to be a movement. We talked about it on our show yesterday, and one of the things that Brian mentioned that is true, and I think is quite notable, is that these strikes, for the most part, or even discussions of a strike, because Arizona, we haven't even begun to discuss Arizona and Kansas yet, but they're mostly happening in states that consider themselves to be so-called right-to-work states, or states that have successfully blocked teachers' unions from entering. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's definitely incredibly significant that in basically every single case, the movement has really been led by grassroots organizations that have been, independent of unions. In particular, Arizona, the organization that started there, Arizona Educators or Education United, has taken the lead, and the union, the sort of the statewide education affiliation has said, we're going to support this protest movement, and you take the reins. So what we're seeing, is also significant in terms of the labor movement and a real sort of return to the roots, where it's really, the workers themselves who are setting the agenda rather than, the union leaders.
I'm looking at a chart here that shows the comparative salaries of high school teachers in the United States as compared to most of the countries of Western Europe. And we are at the bottom. The only European country that pays its teachers less than the United States is the Czech Republic. We pay our teachers roughly half of what teachers make in France and New Zealand and even Germany. Why is it that we just do not have a commitment in this country to paying our teachers? Why do Americans in general not understand that you get what you pay for in public education?
Yeah, I mean, education in the United States has always been occupied a sort of contradictory position, and it's really always been a site of struggle. We didn't have mass high schools in the United States until really the 1920s and the 1930s. There was, and the only reason why there was access eventually, mass access, was because of, movements by the poor and working classes, movements that continued, struggles by Black people, other oppressed nations within the United States. However, really with, what's called the neoliberal turn, which began in the middle of the 1970s, we've seen a systematic attack on public education and a systematic rollback of all the gains that were won through the previous eras of struggle. And really, that's been a bipartisan attack. It's something that, has, each presidency from Reagan, through Obama and now to Trump has, uniformly accepted that, public education should basically be, if not eradicated, then severely reduced.
Last week, the governor of Oklahoma signed a bill that would give teachers, on average, a $6,100 pay raise. I would note that would lift the average pay of Oklahoma teachers from the 49th worst in America to the 31st worst in America. So it doesn't really help that much. But more importantly, the teachers union in Oklahoma says, and here's a quote, "This package doesn't overcome shortfalls caused by 4-day weeks, overcrowded classrooms that deprive kids of the one-on-one attention that they need." We all know teachers who go out of pocket sometimes thousands of dollars just for basic supplies for their classrooms. But this teachers union statement is correct. It doesn't address the issues of overcrowding and 4-day classroom weeks.
You know, the other thing I think is important to point out, because we are witnessing the beginning of a movement. It's already begun.
It has.
These are in right-to-work states where it's illegal to have what's called a closed shop, where everyone has to either pay union dues or agency fees, even though they're represented as part of the collective bargaining unit. Why that's important for people who might not know is that if a union has to spend most of its time going around convincing people who are covered by the collective bargaining agreement for pay, for benefits, to convince them to pay just basic dues rather than to organize or grieve against complaints and problems that teachers are facing, or to fight in contract negotiations, or to prepare for a strike. If you have to spend all of your time just collecting dues because you can't have dues check off, then the union's weaker. And as a consequence, even though these right-wing states say this gives workers the right to work or not work in a union setting, what it basically has done is to diminish or weaken the unions. It's that simple, right?
Absolutely.
Now, what's interesting is, and this is where I was beginning, is that today is April 3rd. 50 years ago today, Martin Luther King Jr. was giving a speech at a mass rally for sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, also a right-to-work state. And it just becomes emblematic, Derek, in a way that sometimes the movements that overcome periods of political or social or anti-labor reaction start not in New York City, not in Berkeley, not in Chicago, not in Washington, D.C., but in places like Tennessee or West Virginia or Kentucky or Oklahoma, the so-called red states, the more conservative areas. But yet, because conditions are so hard and the people are doing it, the demonstrations of courage and unity so obvious, it's had this magnet effect in American history of becoming the starting points for larger movements. Do you think that we're on the verge of something larger?
I think absolutely. You know, schools are a flashpoint of unity in many ways. If you think about how many people are involved in the school system on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, not just students and teachers, but administrators, janitors, counselors, therapists, bus drivers, people who are working on the buses, parents who have students in school, coaches, people who run after-school programs are all sort of, it's a broad base of people who are involved with this. And in many ways, it's sort of a class struggle, because the 1%, they don't send their kids to schools that are underfunded, so they don't really have to worry about this. And so, you really see when, in these movements, you see a sort of, a broad base of unity that extends beyond, just the teachers themselves. And that's also represented in their demands. They're not just concerned, they're obviously rightfully concerned about their pay. Oklahoma teachers haven't had a raise since 2008. But they're also demanding increased investments in education. They're also demanding increased compensation for bus drivers, for support staff. So you really see it's not just sort of one sector of the education system.
It really goes to the notion that the entire system is broken, and it's broken in states all across this country. It's not just the teachers. It's not just the fact that they have to pay out of their own pocket for classroom supplies. But you're right. It's the bus drivers. It's the janitors. It's the school nurse. It's everybody who works for the state or works for the local school district. Everybody is is being set back a little more every single year.
Yeah, and Derek, 60, 70 years ago, teaching was considered like an exalted position in some ways. Maybe it was never paid properly. Same with university professors, and you're a university professor, but over time and over the decades, the status of this profession has been reduced. I mean, it really is now, it's so interesting, like the center of working class organizing. If people thought of themselves as professionals at one time, at a certain point when you don't get raises for, years and sometimes decades, when you're treated like this, when you have to have a second and third job, you have to think of yourself as a worker, not just as a professional, even though you have professional training.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general we're seeing, basically a proletarianization of, so many sectors in the United States. And there's definitely been a systematic attack on teaching as a profession. The idea that anyone can be a teacher, Teach for America, these sort of alternative certification programs are, it's really all part of a systematic attack on public education in the United States. And it's so inspiring to see so many people fighting back against this attack.
Indeed it is. We're going to have to end there. We were joined from Greencastle, Indiana by Derek Ford. Derek is an assistant professor of education studies at DePauw University and a community organizer whose latest book is Education and the Production of Space. Stay tuned to Loud and Clear. We'll be right back after this.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
Welcome back to Loud and Clear. I'm John Kiriakou in studio with my co-host Brian Becker. A report published over the weekend by sports news website Deadspin showed dozens of television news anchors from local stations around the country owned by the conservative Sinclair Broadcasting Group reciting the exact same script warning against what they called biased and false news. The episode reveals the power of a company long criticized for pushing its conservative agenda into homes across the country. We're joined from New York by Tim Carr. Tim is the Senior Director of Strategy and Communications at Free Press. Tim, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Tim, Free Press has been working on the issue of Sinclair and its right-wing agenda for many years. Are you at all surprised by this little scandal?
No, Sinclair has a long history of using its very extensive network of local television stations to push its own political agenda. And it's only under the Trump administration that there's been a near perfect pairing of news organization with a political leader who would like the media to mouth his agenda. Trump has recently been tweeting in favor of Sinclair only because it has a tendency to take a lot of his talking points, like the false news, the fake news talking points, and putting them out over its network of local stations.
One of the things that really troubles me is a very recent poll that was done by the Pew Research Center that said that 85% of Americans trust their local news outlets. That's more than the 77% of Americans who trust their family or friends for news. And I think most Americans have no idea when their local television station is controlled or owned by Sinclair.
They don't, and Sinclair doesn't advertise that to local viewers, but they do require that their network of stations carry what's called must-run commentary. They have a person who was a former Trump staffer, Boris Epshteyn, who creates a 2 to 3 minute commentary that Sinclair then ships out to its large network of stations. That they control about 190 stations across the country, and they require that they air that commentary. And that commentary has included tirades against undocumented immigrants, tirades against what Trump would call fake news. I mean, it's very much in line with the agenda of the president. And so that's why a lot of people have come to call Sinclair Trump TV. It's sort of an unofficial propaganda outlet for the president.
And in fact, the Washington Post says that the broadcast areas of Sinclair stations voted for Trump over Hillary Clinton by a 19 percentage point margin on average. Another thing, too, and this is something that I didn't know until this scandal broke in the last 2 days, was that Sinclair owns stations across all 4 of the major broadcast networks. So it's not like it's every local Fox station is owned by Sinclair. We're talking Fox, ABC, CBS, NBC, and some unaffiliated TV stations, as well as 9 Univision affiliates in Spanish.
Yeah, and interestingly, Sinclair also has concentrated ownership in what are called political battleground states. Battleground states are those states like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania that often are a decisive factor in national elections. And Sinclair has concentrated ownership in those politically charged regions, not only because it benefits from political advertising, a lot of the political advertising, which amounts to billions of dollars in a general election year, is channeled into those local markets where they're trying to influence voters. So it benefits not only from the flow of political ad money, but also from it for its ability to sway important local elections whose outcome could have national relevance.
This video that Deadspin published a couple of days ago has already been viewed over 8 million times, according to CNN. It was CNN that broke this story in March, but it was Deadspin that layered the video clips of all of these dozens and dozens of local anchors reading exactly the same script, complaining about fake news and all of these other horrible left-wing conspiracies. So I wonder, is there anything that anybody can do? I mean, what do you do in a case like this? Do you complain to the FCC? Do you write a letter to your congressman? Or are we stuck with right-wing ownership of much of our national media?
Well, there are things you can do. Unfortunately, right now we have an FCC under a Trump-appointed chairman, Ajit Pai,
right,
who is willing to kick out all the regulatory stops for Sinclair to get even larger. Sinclair is in the process of gobbling up Tribune Media, which owns 43 more television stations. That would give Sinclair about 230 stations with a broadcast reach to more than 70% of the country. And if the FCC is in place to ensure that there is local competition and diversity and choice in the media, they have fallen down on the job. They are deregulating broadcast ownership limits so that Sinclair can move forward. One of the things that Free Press has done to oppose that is we're taking the FCC to court. We are suing them for a series of decisions that they've made to change the way broadcast ownership is limited in the United States. So we've also asked people to write to the FCC to voice their opposition to Sinclair's planned merger with Tribune Media. That has yet to be approved. Both the Department of Justice and the FCC have to sign off on that. So we're hoping that public pressure can prevent Sinclair from getting even larger.
Donald Trump tweeted something yesterday, as he is, actually it was this morning, as he is wont to do. He doubles down on these issues. He said, the fake news networks, those that knowingly have a sick and biased agenda, are worried about the competition and quality of Sinclair broadcasting. The fakers at CNN, NBC, ABC, and CBS have done so much dishonest reporting that they should only be allowed to get awards for fiction. So those are tough words, but not as tough as Mark Hyman's words. Mark Hyman is a former Sinclair executive who also leads a commentary segment that's one of the Sinclair must-run segments that you talked about at the beginning of this segment. And he said this, and this was broadcast on national television. He said, and I quote, "Listen up closely, snowflakes. Yes, I'm talking to you. You, the social justice warrior who whines for trigger warnings and safe spaces. College isn't a babysitting service." Well, that's not news. That's not even really commentary. But this is what's force-fed to people all across America. What can we do about this?
Well, yes, it is. And the problem is that a lot of people who do trust their local news outlets watch this without understanding the structure behind the ownership of local television stations. The idea for the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, was put in place to promote localism, diversity, and competition in use of the public airwaves. And the agency has fallen down on that job, and it's allowed for companies like Sinclair to own now nearly 200 local television stations across the country. And what Sinclair does is, rather than support local news content, rather than to promote diversity of voices of the airwaves, it creates a central news hub, and then it syndicates out that news coverage to all of its stations. So we're losing local newsrooms. We're losing local reporters. And in its place, we're getting this, in the case of the Trump era, this sort of propaganda that's very much in a line with the Trump administration, which just so happens to be considering a number of regulations that would help Sinclair get even bigger. So there's this quid pro quo going on that should be very concerning for everyone. And there are a lot of things that people can do. They can challenge the licenses of their local station. Every 8 years, their station license, broadcast license, comes up for renewal, and there is a mechanism at the FCC to challenge those licenses. But we can also pressure our members of Congress to speak out. Congress has oversight of the FCC. You can speak out directly to the FCC and oppose this merger, something that Free Press is coordinating right now. Or you can support our work and our legal challenges against the FCC, which is trying to push through these deregulatory measures that would allow for Sinclair to control even more local media.
Very important words right there. This merger is a $3.9 billion merger with Tribune Media, which would add 42 more local TV stations to Sinclair's lineup. And there's a law in this country limiting single station owners from reaching 39% of the national television audience. This FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, has already ended net neutrality. Everybody's watching to see what he does with this Sinclair Tribune media deal. Unfortunately, though, we are out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. We were joined from New York by Tim Carr. He's the Senior Director for Strategy and Communications at Free Press. You're listening to Loud and Clear. Please stay tuned, and we'll be right back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
Welcome back to Loud and Clear. I'm John Kiriakou.
And I'm Brian Becker.
Russian President Vladimir Putin arrived in Ankara today to launch Turkey's first nuclear power plant with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, also to discuss Syria, energy, and defense issues. The Russian State Nuclear Energy Agency will build the $20 billion nuclear power facility, and the Russian State News Agency also noted that Russia will expedite the delivery of the S-400 air defense system to Turkey. We're joined from Moscow by Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. Welcome, Mark.
Brian, John, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Loud and Clear.
Thanks for joining us. Mark, this seems like a very substantive kind of meeting. It doesn't seem to be window dressing. When you're talking about a major air defense system, you're talking about a $20 billion nuclear power facility, and then you've invited the president of Iran at the same time. What's this all about?
I'm not quite so sure. I see this rather as kind of political theater between two countries that are still at odds on many things, but for both countries' national interests and geopolitical interests have decided that they are going to play each other off of their enemies in kind of a mutually embracing cooperation while they keep daggers poised at each other's backs.
Again, for the audience, Mark, we've talked about this many times, but there may be people listening to the show here on the Washington radio stations for the first time. Just walk us very quickly through how the relations between Russia and Turkey have gone through like an up and a down and an up and a down. And as you say, the animus isn't disappeared, even though there appears to be this mutual embrace at the moment.
Sure. Turkey, as some of our viewers may have forgotten, is actually a member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which still keeps Russia in its sights as its primary enemy as it advances to the east across Europe, getting ever closer now, literally on Russia's borders. And since Russia and Turkey, however, have had fair economic relations, and political relations after the end of the Cold War up until the beginning of the Syria conflict, where Turkey from the very beginning has been part of an alliance, literally illegally arming, training, and salarying sectarian militants, often literally embedded and allied with al-Qaeda to overthrow the Syrian government, which Russia has a mutual defense pact with. And Russia could simply not allow Syria to so close to its own borders, simply basically 24 hours by jeep drive away from southern Russia up through the Caucasus. A failed state and a terrorist breeding ground like has evolved in Libya, with the concentration of forces arrayed against the Syrian government being almost entirely Wahhabist jihadi and Islamists, to come to power in Syria, and any combination of those forces. And as they ended up on opposite sides of this conflict, with Turkey from the very beginning being the main logistic and support route through which these jihadis were funded, not only by Turkey, but by the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. But they all had to, everything had to and continues to come through Turkey. There's no other place that they can be supplied from except for in the very south of Syria, where there has always been limited conflict. A Russian jet was shot down on the Syrian-Turkish border in 2015, and its pilot then murdered, a war crime, as he descended in a parachute. And the presumed suspect of this, as it was taped by video, was actually a Turkish nationalist, a member of the Green Wolves, who were fighting alongside the so-called Syrian rebels in northern Syria. After that, a Russian ambassador was killed in Turkey itself, gunned down. Relations since then have picked up with the start of the Astana Agreement, as Turkey has had its own disagreements with the United States and the EU come to the fore. The Astana Agreement is a way for Russia, Turkey, and Iran to come to the forefront of the Syrian conflict and to try to manage each other's often completely opposite, at least when it comes to Russia and Turkey and Iran and Turkey, their own interests in Syria and the Syrian conflict. What Turkey brings to the table is they literally represent the enemy, the jihadis that are trying to overthrow the Syrian government. And by dealing with Turkey, and only Turkey, which again is the only supply route through which they continue to be armed and supplied on a daily basis as convoys of trucks, fuel, ammunition, weapons, food, etc., go back and forth across the Turkish border into northern Syria, Idlib, northern Aleppo, etc., that by dealing with Turkey, Russia can cut Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the UK out of the negotiation process. Turkey has its own reasons for doing this, being extremely angered during the attempted coup to overthrow Erdogan a few years ago by elements within the Turkish military, which Erdogan has blamed on the United States. I think it much more likely that the U.S. knew something about it and simply didn't tell him about it. I think that's the actual source of the grievance. For once, I don't think the U.S. actually had their hand in this attempted coup because it was far too clumsy and had not the slightest chance of success, unlike their usual efforts of meddling. And also how close the United States has come to the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, which the Turkish government regards as being synonymous with the Kurdish rebel group in Turkey, the PKK.
Mark, let me ask you a quick question too, because I think you're right on all of this so far. Here you've got Turkey that has poor relations with its neighbors, Greece and Cyprus. It has terrible relations with Israel. It's actively fighting its own Kurds, Syria's Kurds, Iraq's Kurds. It has so much more to gain with in a close relationship with the Russians. than the Russians have in a close relationship with Turks, I think. So why would the Russians seek out this warmer relationship with Turkey? What do the Russians get out of this?
Okay, well, one thing, Russian-Turkish trade is not insignificant. Russia does want increased energy trade with Turkey. That includes both nuclear and oil and gas. Whether these Turk Stream which Turkey needs badly, whether these Turk Stream pipelines ever end up really extending across into Europe is another matter. But at the very least, pipelines are needed into Turkey. Russia needs to end the Syrian conflict, and Turkey is the one to deal with, where they can deal just with Turkey as representing the jihadis and no one else. They can cut all the rest out of this process. And also, Russia sees this conflict between Turkey and the EU over migration, with the Syrian and other refugees, and with the United States over the Kurds in the Syrian conflict, which the Pentagon has backed from the beginning, while as the CIA backed some of the Islamist groups that were also allied with Turkey. They see a chance to draw a wedge between Turkey and NATO. I don't think they think that Turkey is going. I don't think anyone thinks that Turkey is going to walk out of NATO anytime soon. But simply the increased tensions and the inability to reach geostrategic agreements between Turkey and the rest of NATO on the Middle East region is incredibly advantageous to Russia, to preventing exactly the type of conflicts that have been involved in trying to overthrow the Syrian government. So there's a lot for Russia to gain here, but there's a lot at stake too.
I think people don't know, of course, Americans don't know much about history or geography or much about those kind of areas, but Russia, when it was the Russian Socialist Federation, the year before it became the Soviet Union, was the first country in the world to recognize the Kemalist Turkish Revolution. That was 1920 and 21. There was the Treaty of 1925 that cemented Turkish-Soviet relations. It was only after World War II when the United States incorporated both Greece and Turkey into NATO, a U.S.-led anti-Soviet military alliance, that everything changed. I mean, shattered in terms of Turkish-Russian or Turkish-Soviet relations. But it does demonstrate, Mark, that things can go through historical shifts and changes as a result of big new alignments and realignments. Are you anticipating anything like that? We have 1 minute left, so that, of course, that's a short answer for a big question.
Yeah, I mean, we also can't forget that the U.S. put nuclear missiles in Turkey, which precipitated Russia, the Soviet Union, to put missiles in Cuba, which precipitated the Cuban Missile Crisis. And a lot of people don't know that the U.S., in an agreement to end the crisis, pulled weapons out. So that's another Turkish-Russian historical instrument. I don't foresee any great immediate geopolitical shift. But certainly Erdogan's swing to Islam and his focus on presenting himself as some kind of ummah of the Islamic world, drawing closer to these jihadi groups and regimes, does mark a real shift. Turkey is no longer a military guaranteed secular republic. It is moving in the direction of the Islamic world. That's a long-term process, but NATO and the U.S. aren't quite ready to give up Turkey yet. It's too important for their geopolitical control of the region, airspace, and energy assets in the Middle East. So that will be a gradual shifting away rather than a dramatic immediate shift, I believe.
We will leave it right there. We were joined from Moscow by Mark Sleboda. Mark is an international affairs and security analyst. Stay tuned to Loud and Clear. We're going to take a break and be right back.
Loud and Clear. Loud and Clear.
Welcome back to Loud and Clear. I'm John Kiriakou.
And I'm Brian Becker.
Prosecutors in the Russia probe revealed last night that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein authorized them in August of last year to investigate allegations that President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was colluding with Russian government officials to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. The revelation comes amid a lawsuit filed by Manafort, which challenges the special counsel's investigative authority and the indictments already issued. We're joined from New York by Jim Kavanaugh. He's the editor of thepolemicist.net And we're joined from Pittsburgh by Dan Kovalik. He's a human rights and labor lawyer who's also the author of the soon-to-be-released book, The Plot to Attack Iran. Welcome back, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
My first question, I think, has to be, is this just the desperation of a man who's facing the rest of his life in prison, or is there something to this legal challenge that the general counsel has overstepped his bounds? Or the special counsel, rather, has overstepped his bounds? Go ahead, Jim.
It looks to me like Manafort is desperate. And if I read Rosenstein's memo correctly, he gave them, the problem here isn't Mueller, it's Rosenstein. Rosenstein gave him the authority to do this. It was this weird paragraph that he could investigate any crime committed and payments received during the tenure of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. So for some reason, during that time, they could go into anything they wanted. I don't see what that had to do with Russian. That ended in 2014. Yanukovych's tenure. So I don't see what that had to do with the Russian meddling in the 2016 election, but Rosenstein's kind of directed Mueller to investigate it.
The timing here, just for the audience, because everybody's eyes are now glazing over with the Russiagate stuff.
Seriously.
I mean,
they really are.
Unless you happen to be on our show 1,800 times talking about it, which both Dan and Jim have done, thankfully. Yeah, it's hard to keep up. But just let's listen to what Jim Kavanaugh just said. The coup that overthrew Yanukovych was February 22nd, 2014. Yanukovych was not, quote, a pro-Russian puppet. He was a player. He was a corrupt guy who was playing both sides, both the EU side and the Russian side. The one thing was he wasn't willing to have Ukraine become part of NATO. You can't play both sides and be in NATO. So there was a coup, and the U.S. supported the coup, and the coup dislodged him from power, and he escaped, and a new government was created. That was February 2014. Before that, Paul Manafort, who became Donald Trump's chairman for a brief amount of time during the 2016 campaign, was functioning as a lobbyist for Yanukovych in Washington, currying favor for the Yanukovych government, getting paid. Others did too, perhaps Tony Podesta. We'll see about that. But nonetheless, that was before the election campaign. And probably the Putin government saw that meddling by an American as something that would possibly damage Russian-Ukrainian relations, not the other way around. But nonetheless, what Manafort's accused of in this indictment, Dan Kovalik, is laundering the money that he got from illicit work in Ukraine before 2014, then not paying taxes on it, and laundering it by buying real estate properties in America to clean that dirty money up. Again, nothing to do with the election campaign.
Yeah, well, I think that is what is most concerning, and that is that, you know, the essence of Mueller's charge is to go after, you know, alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. And as you say, the indictment against Manafort has nothing to do with that. But it does appear that he got the authority from the DOJ to engage in the investigation of the very items that Manafort was indicted for, though they're wholly independent from the whole Russiagate saga. So I don't know what we make of it. I mean, I think it's probably hard to argue that what Mueller is doing is improper given his charge. But it does, to me, cast a whole question on the entire investigation, and that is whether it is, in fact, some type of witch hunt, you know, that they're going to find all these secondary, tertiary allegations against people associated with Trump that don't go to the Russia collusion, and then they're going to claim that somehow they've succeeded in their charge. And it's just, I think it's going to really confuse a lot of people and maybe fool a lot of people that there's more to the Russiagate allegations than there really are.
I think one of the ways we may be able to tell if there's anything is with Alex van der Zwaan. Alex van der Zwaan was an attorney connected to Paul Manafort. He was an attorney at Skadden Arps, which is one of the largest, most prestigious law firms in the world, has offices all around the world. He was also tied to Rick Gates. And he's a Dutch national who's the son-in-law of a Russian oligarch by the name of German Khan. Not a Russian name, but a Russian oligarch. He was sentenced today to 30 days in prison and fined $20,000 for lying to Mueller. when Mueller asked him what exactly his connections were to Manafort and to Gates. He told a lie. He got indicted. He's the first one to be sentenced. He was the last one to be indicted, but the first one to be sentenced. That tells me that he's willing to talk. And he likely isn't going to just talk about Rick Gates, because we already know that Rick Gates has been offered a deal to talk about Paul Manafort. So I think we're going to see in short order if there really is anything to this collusion or if there's not. Now, we've said on this show, and I stand by this, we've said a million times, there likely is nothing to the collusion. But we said this in the very beginning, before the special counsel even got started. And in fact, we did it with Jim and with Dan, where we all agreed that we were going to see largely throwaway felonies, making a false statement, perjury, conspiracy, etc. And if there were serious charges, they wouldn't have anything to do with collusion. And I think that that's exactly what we have playing out here.
Well, Jim, let's talk about what this now sentenced lawyer, 30 days, that's a pretty...